Welcome to Classical Education, a podcast for those who believe in rediscovering the art of asking questions, engaging in conversation, and attending to the ideas at the heart of well-ordered teaching and learning. I invite you to join me on a journey in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful as a participant in the great conversation and listen to the many voices coming from the world of classical education. This episode is sponsored by our upcoming conference sponsors, Beautiful Feet Books, Eighth Day Books, and the Classic Learning Test, also known as the CLT exam. Thanks to their generous support, we can offer a discount on our conference tickets. You will receive $20 off using a special discount code. This code is in the show notes of this episode, and it is valid through June 1st. Once you grab that code, head over to our website, beautifulteaching.com, to register. Thanks for listening to the show. Today I have a very interesting episode. I have a few of the people on my beautiful teaching team here with us today. We're going to talk a little bit about the upcoming classical education conference that we're hosting, and I wanted you all to meet as many of the speakers as you could who could join us today to give you an idea of how exciting and fun and wonderful this conference is going to be. So I have with me here today Karen Glass, Mark Signorelli, Mariah Martinez, Jonathan Fiore, and Peach Smith. So all of you guys, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to talk to each one of you. Y'all are like some of my favorite people in the world of classical education. And so thank you for taking time to be with me here today. So before we get started, I was thinking we should tell our listeners a little bit about why we chose the theme Vital Ideas. We had several different theme ideas we were tossing around, and we came up with Vital Ideas. And I'd like if one of you wants to share what that means to us as classical educators and why we chose that as a theme. I would love to hear, I think our audience would like to hear why we chose that as a theme and how that's going to impact the talks we give. Does anybody want to start?
Sure, I'll jump in. So, Vital Ideas is for me personally, a wonderful title, because I'm both a classical teacher and I train teachers, and as you know, classical education is in many ways it's taking off. People are interested in it, but they don't really know what it is. What does this really mean? And this conference is going to go into the details of how. Um, I have messages every day from teachers saying, I just don't understand how to do this. I've read the books, I've read the theory. How do I actually make this happen? And I'm thrilled that this conference will provide some of those tools. What are the vital ideas? But then also, how do we implement them? And I love that the talks complement each other. You may have one that goes into, well, why are we teaching these books? Or why do we teach science in this way? And then another one that goes into the how, the details, the nitty gritty for every day, because that's what teachers really need, that are on the ground. Whether you're a new teacher or you're a seasoned teacher coming in, the question is always, what is it I'm doing? What is the vital idea? What's the purpose? How do I do it?
Good. That's a great answer, Peach. We have Erin Mitchell just joined us. I forgot that you were coming in too, Erin. Thanks for coming on. We're talking about what the idea of the conference theme being vital ideas. What does that mean? And Peach gave a really great explanation for our listeners. Does anybody else want to add to that, what Peach said?
I I love what she said. It was great. And I think it's the whole idea of vital ideas is so important because what we do stems so much from what we believe, what we believe about people, what we believe the purpose of education is. And so really understanding like the core ideas behind what we do flows so well into the what do I do when I'm teaching? How do I apply this? And so I think it's going to be really exciting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Anybody else?
And that whole idea of making ideas vital, I mean, that's central to the whole classical project, right? I mean, we're working in a tradition that's over 2,000 years old. That's very easy to look at and say it's passé or it's obsolete or it's something dead. And what classical educators are trying to do on a daily basis, as Peach mentioned, in their classroom, is bring that tradition alive, right? Bring it, make it something vital, make it something still living, still applicable, still viable, and still capable of shaping souls in 2024.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. And classical education also recognizes that whether or not we agree with the many ideas that have built our modern world, they are still there and they are still the foundation of what we do, whether as a continuing of that tradition or a unconscious or conscious rejection of that tradition. And so it's very vital as classical educators that we allow our students, we give our students an encounter with those ideas and allow them to experience that trajectory so that they do not, so that they can move and operate in this world with a greater understanding of what the ideas are behind our presuppositions, behind our actions.
Hmm.
We often go around assuming certain values, not realizing that those values have an origin point, and classical education really allows us to see those in a much more clearer light.
Hmm. Hmm. I think for me, also the idea, the word vital meaning life, that these are living ideas. These aren't just ideas that we've pulled off the shelf. These are ideas that have stood the test of time. They're living, they give life to us. And I think about even just the transcendentals, the true, the good, and the beautiful, and how those terms are often just tossed around and people don't really know what they mean. They say, oh, yeah, we're a classical school and we have the, we're teaching the true, the good, and the beautiful. Well, what does that mean? And I think one of the goals that I have for the conference, at least the talk that I'm going to be giving called Loving Many Things, I want to express what these vital ideas are and how they come through as the true and the good and the beautiful, so that our attendees could walk away and really have a tangible understanding of what it means to bring the true, the good, and the beautiful into their lessons, into their atmosphere, in their classrooms. And Karen, do you have anything you want to add?
Thanks, Adrian. I was thinking the same thing that you were, that when we talk about the title of the conference being living ideas or vital ideas, sorry, that word is the vital word, meaning because it means living, is such a critical part of what we're talking about. They aren't just 2,000-year old, dusty old tradition that, um, as if we're trying to carry around or be impressive because we're attaching ourselves to important people from the past. But the fact that they're just like absolutely living, life-giving ideas. Um, and I really think that it taps into the idea that education is for life and not just for, preparing you to have a job that allows you to earn money, but you know, to inject something into your life that's going to make a difference no matter what you're doing, you know.
Exactly. It's quite the opposite of a data driven model of school.
That's exactly what I wanted to bring in. We were actually discussing this not an hour ago because and I think this is, I'm hoping that not only teachers and parents will come, but board members, people that are trying to start schools. And we have a school that's visiting mine right now, trying to sort of learn, how does this work? And the question keeps coming back: how do you assess? What's the data like? Are your scores higher? And sort of you're trying to politely say that's not the point. And
Right.
uh, you know that standard based education, those metrics, is so far from what the point is behind this. It's shaping that soul, that human being, into those vital ideas, revealing to them the beauty and the goodness and the truth and the depth and the humanity of these concepts. And as I said just an hour ago, I was describing a student who really struggles with academics, but is a wonderful speaker and has such a soul that sees beauty in art and connects ideas, struggles with writing it down, struggles with math, struggles with all the things that the test looks at, and yet is such a incredible soul, and in many ways is able to articulate in class better than some who's do well on the test. And I love that. That
Mm.
it's beautiful to see that.
That's great. That's
Yeah,
really
it's
good,
not,
Peach.
and that word living suggests that this education is organic. It's humane. It's an encounter with human beings who have ideas and thoughts, not simply the transmission of a summary of the current state of human knowledge, which has been the modern scientific Baconian goal of modern education. Um, John Henry Newman talks a lot about this, right? As does Eva Braun, right? How our modern educational establishment is about updating students about where current scholarship is at, preparing them to be future scholars as well, which has a noble goal in its own right, but it doesn't allow us to see meaning. It doesn't allow us to see people, and it doesn't allow us to see ourselves in a truly life-giving way.
That's really, really good. One of the things, the next question I have for each of you, I want our listeners to hear a little bit more about each of you and about the talk you're going to be doing. So I wanted to start off by um, introducing each one of you with through the question of who has had the greatest influence on your philosophy of education and why. So who would like to answer that question first?
I can.
Okay, Mariah Martinez.
The person who has had the biggest influence, I think, on my philosophy education is Saint Augustine. Um, Mostly because he's had the biggest influence on me as a human being, I think. Um, but I mean, I see education truly as a way to order your loves correctly, to order your passions and desires, and toward ultimate good, which is God. And then kind of going down to the other higher goods. And so I think that education plays such a huge role, and C.S. Lewis talks about this too in Abolition of Man, in training and ordering your affections to pursue truth, to do good, to love beauty. And so, yeah, I think Augustine.
Yeah, that's good. In fact, Mariah, if I'm not mistaken, in about Abolition of Man, he quotes that part from Augustine.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah,
We make all our seniors read it every year.
that's good. All right, who wants to answer the question next?
I can go next
Okay,
because it's obvious and easy.
Karen Glass. Okay, so
Yeah, when anybody says, who's the biggest influence on Karen Glass, like the whole world probably knows this answer already, because of course the answer is Charlotte Mason. I started reading Charlotte Mason in 1994, and I still like go back and I read her volumes again. And every time I reread a volume, I learn something new after over 25 years of reading them. Oh gosh, it's closer to 30 now, isn't it? But yeah, I still learn something new because her depth of wisdom is just that, you know, just that profound. And because I've kind of made it a project to read the things that Charlotte Mason read, I've also, dipped into the whole like pool of classical educators, including Augustine and others, because her ideas just align and resonate. So her primary thing, one of her main principles is education is the science of relations, which I feel is just another way of saying that you need to order your loves correctly. You need to learn to love what's right. And so she just really is part of that tradition. So like I said, it was going to be really easy for me to answer that question.
yeah. And I think that our listeners know that I'm kindred with you on that. Because I bring her up at almost if I don't bring her up on a podcast, somebody does. So yeah, for the same reasons. And I agree, Karen. I still read her and feel the same way, that I get something new. And I think it's because her books are expressing those living ideas, which means they transcend. So they go across centuries, they go across age groups. It doesn't matter how old or young you are, it's going to be true because it's living. It's a vital her works are vital ideas, right?
Yeah.
Okay, who will go next?
I just want to jump on
Oh, sure.
even about Charlotte Mason. She's such an essential read, and she's such a great synthesizer of classical thought in a modern age because she really is a public educator. And so for public educators who are like, okay, so classical education, this education that's for small groups of, wealthy students who are well educated, what does that mean for me in my context? Well, Charlotte Mason has answers because she's
Yes.
about classical education for all, and so she's so powerful there. My wife Kieran and we're both homeschooled, and so in our talk, we want to talk a lot about both our mothers, who are incredible ladies. Both lacked the standard collegiate teacher education, and so they had an uphill battle. But I think because of that, they lacking that standard progressive training, they grabbed onto people like Charlotte Mason. Both our mothers read Charlotte Mason, and through Charlotte Mason, got exposed to the great conversation, to the classical tradition, and they did such a great job giving us just those books, reading to us, having us just read the books, and that that logos centric education had a dramatic effect on both of our lives. It's changed both of our lives. Um, and in reading those books, for me personally, one of the books that had the most influence on me has to be The Republic. I mean, I think there's no book that has more shaped my philosophy than The Republic, particularly this idea of education as turning our souls towards the universal, towards God. This danger of our passions and our desires leading us down this downward spiral, right? As allegorized by the Republic's decline. That plus reading lots of Greek and Roman history with Wes Callahan and Dr. George Grant were some of the influences that I was going to talk about.
Yeah, I haven't heard Dr. George Grant's name in a while, but yes, he's also very good.
Yeah. Yeah, he's the one that he's a great one of the best. If he has a school down in Kentucky or Tennessee, I believe.
Tennessee.
Tennessee, yeah. I never had the opportunity of meeting him, but I watched his lectures on a DVD set back in, I don't know, the early 2000s, and he's the one that both both despite the fact that he was a staunch Presbyterian, made me fall in love with the Middle Ages. He's totally in love with medievalism and all of that. And so, we had to study cathedrals and the music. But the main idea that he always gave me from that was ideas have consequences, Richard Weaver.
Mm-hmm.
Ideas have consequences. And that was a powerful idea that I've taken with me, definitely.
That's
And
amazing.
if you don't mind, I could piggyback on that because the thinker I was going to mention, I did struggle with this because you asked me this question on any given week, and I'll give you a different answer on what week it is. But the thinker that I settled on was Alistair McIntyre, and in part uh, because I mean, he's been a huge influence on me just as a person, as a thinker, as well as an educator. And in part, it's because of that sense, that Jonathan referred to, the sense that ideas really do have a momentous consequence for him, right? That getting these moral ideas right, understanding these moral questions in the right way, the fate of lives and civilizations hangs on that, right? So that was inspiring to me. That was something that really drew me in as a young person when I first encountered McIntyre's work. But the thing that I really took away from his work, and I think have carried into my work as an educator, is his sense. I mean, so clearly McIntyre has a profound diagnosis of the ills of the modern world, right? And he was like, I think he was the first author to confirm for me my budding intuition that something had really gone amiss in the modern world. That looking around at our culture and the kind of the spiritual state of modernity, something was really off, and something seemed really dissonant from what I had read about what life and culture was like in past times. So he really kind of confirmed and deepened my sense that something was amiss. But then he also had a sense of how we can live in the face of that cultural privation, how we can kind of reclaim modes of living, modes of civilized life, in the midst of this kind of civilizational crisis. And he pointed to specific traditions, a specific tradition through which we can do that, right? Through so those familiar with McIntyre's work know that he espouses the Aristotelian ethical tradition, and sees that as really the turn that modern man needs to make, or the return that modern man needs to make. And in doing that, we can reclaim and reappropriate and recapture that tradition and make it vital again, right? And so for all his profound grasp of the crises of modernity, there's nothing despairing in his work. It's to the contrary, right? He's very confident that we can reclaim these ancient sources of wisdom, and that has been something that I think I have carried over into the classroom, into the school building, and now as a classical educator, that's something, I think I go to my work very cognizant, as Jonathan was talking about before, about how these ideas are in the air, right? That we're living in a certain kind of cultural milieu that's very adverse to the ends that we're aiming to achieve. But we have the tools and we have the resources to go to that battle, to go into that battle effectively on a daily basis. And I've taken much of that from McIntyre.
Which book or books would you recommend for our listeners to read by him?
Yeah, After Virtues is
That's yeah,
his classic, and it's probably the best place to start. It's the one, if you read that one, I think you have the crux of his
yeah.
thought.
That's what I thought you were going to say. Yeah. Okay, Aaron Mitchell, would you share with us who has had the greatest impact on your philosophy of education?
So when you question, I found myself sort of at a crossroads. I couldn't really decide, but I felt like there was a way in which the two thinkers I was thinking of were, obviously connected. The first person I thought of was Lewis, and specifically in the Abolition of Man, when he talks about the older versus the newer model of education, right? And in the newer model, he talks about sort of the conception of human beings as sort of raw material to be fashioned in a new way, right? But that the older model was rather about trying to he uses the image of an older bird teaching a younger bird to fly, right? And that what that means is there's a recognition that I and the student have a shared nature, and that the student doesn't exist for me to sort of perform experiments on and see what will come out, but rather for me to try to put them through the same things that I have gone through, so that they can become in sort of the same direction that I am becoming, right? Um, the other thinker I thought of was Plato, and just the analogy of the cave, right? Which seems to me to in the end be communicating the same idea, right? That I, as the teacher, am not attempting to take something that I have and give it to you, but rather to draw you out and bring you to some kind of an encounter.
Mm, hmm. Yeah, that's really, really good, Aaron. Peach, how about you?
Okay, so the question of who is rather a little bit more of what. So I was homeschooled long before it was legal. So we had to move quite a bit as a result. Quite literally from one country to the next, because it just, you couldn't do that. And my parents were inadvertently Charlotte Mason educators. um they'd had, being in England, they had some concept of this, but it just wasn't a thing until I already had children. So in many ways they had access to that concept, that idea. And so I was surrounded by books. I was surrounded by art, by beauty. I was taken to museums and so on. And I would say that really some of the greatest influences on me, and I really thought about this question. One was, I had an older children's Bible when I was very young. It had the most beautiful plated illustrations in it. The language was beautiful, and the language of that children's Bible and the art and the paintings in that book that I read when I was, 5 or 6 or 7 years old, um, was profound. I loved that book. I would fall asleep with it. The language of that book shaped me profoundly. my mother was also an artist and had these gigantic, 4.5 foot tall books of paintings. And she would open the book, and I would literally lie on this book as a small child and crawl around it and notice the details of the Venus or this. And really, I came to know these paintings so intimately well. And the third was my grandmother. My grandmother was a Renaissance woman in many ways. Literature, history, sciences, biology. She was immersed in all of them, but she was primarily a musician. And so I got to hear her play the piano. I got to hear all the great symphonies and the great choral works from the choir that she was in. So it was really, by the time I got to the dialogues and the Republic and all the great works, in a way, it wasn't a shock. It was already it was already there because not having been part of any school system whatsoever, really having grown up in many ways the quintessential Charlotte Mason concept of nature studies, again completely unplanned, but having that time in the outdoors and having access to these beautiful books is really what shaped me profoundly as a person, and shaped that love for what we're calling the vital ideas, long before I even really understood what any of this was. So it's not so much a person or a who or one thing. It was really that privilege, in spite of the many challenges that we had, of growing up immersed in these vital ideas on a daily basis. And it was unforced. There was no such thing as a homeschool curriculum back then. It just didn't exist. So it was books, great art, music, the outdoors, discussions. We read the dialogues, on a boat at some point, when I was 10. And it was just life. So in
Yeah,
many ways, that was what influenced me.
and
If
Peach, I
you, if,
I I know,
oh,
Peach,
oh,
that you also got to read Shakespeare and Plutarch when you were very young
Yes.
as well. So you really are one of
Yes.
the rare people in the classical education movement. In fact, as a classical education leader, as I would call you, you're one of the rare ones who actually had this kind of education.
Right. And it was truly just not planned. My parents just looked at the state of the schools at the time, and especially with all the upheavals that were happening in society, they said, there's just no way we're going to put our children into this, and risked arrest, and a lot of other things to make sure we did not have that experience of what they were seeing in these schools. And so, as you mentioned Shakespeare, I mean, I think by the time we were 5 or 6, this was normal to recite Shakespeare because we loved it. We thought it was such fun. It wasn't analyzed, it wasn't studied, it wasn't read. It was an evening entertainment that everyone would grab a book and we'd go through Hamlet or Macbeth or Henry V, and this was fun, you know. So, a couple of years ago in my school, I suggested that our 6th grade could put on Henry V, and there was some consternation. They're much too young. There's no way they're going to get it. It's impossible. And next thing you know, you have 3.5 foot tall Henry V, what's more under the breach? And they're having a blast. It's meant to be enjoyed. So, yeah.
Karen, I'm sorry. I think you wanted to respond to her too.
no, I was just going to say the same thing that you did. That we've all talked about, classical educators as being the thing that influenced us most greatly. And Peach actually had a classical education, the experience of it. So yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah, it is. It's very special, and I'm really happy to have you on our conference as one of the speakers. It's going to be great.
Thank you.
And you're going to be speaking about science, teaching science, which is lovely. Peach is one of those people who can teach about teaching anything because she experienced all of it. So she knows how to do all of it. Okay, so one of the other questions I wanted to ask, because I think it would be good for our audience to hear, is this question: what makes being an educator in the classical tradition different than just being an educator per se?
I mean, the first thought that comes to mind is, as I said before, the goals of what we're trying to accomplish. And I think a lot of education even a lot of education that seems to be called traditional education in this country uh, is still education that is bathed in the ideas of the Enlightenment, which has as its objective, and I'm not talking about the last 100 years. I'm talking about even you go back to the founding. A lot of the founding fathers are no longer talking about classical education. They're advocating for this new education which aims to have no real definition. Right? Jefferson in his college says, "Hey, let's have people take anything they want. You know, no form to it. Just whatever you want to study. You want to study business? Cool, study business." But the objective comes much more about advancing knowledge, advancing our power over nature, transmitting a state of knowledge. And then, as the middle class wants more education, we want skills. We want definable skills that will make me more marketable in the workplace, that will give me material advantages. And as classical educators, um, that's not our objective. Classical education, we should call it liberal arts education, is a preparation. It's propedeutic. It's preparing the student's soul and intellect to study philosophy, to think deeply about the deepest issues. Why are we here? Who are we? What does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to be human? And what are the things most worthy of my aspirations? Um, and this comes from Plato. Turning our soul from the potential to the actual, right?
Mm.
And so, right from the beginning, what we're trying to accomplish is different. Then, of course, the means is different as well, as you guys have already talked about the great books. When I took my courses with Callahan, uh, the education consisted of simply reading the great texts and works and discussing them. Um, and that method, the liberal arts, is different as well because the goals are different.
Hmm. Hmm. Does anyone want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah, just that uh sort of what I was talking about earlier, and what Jonathan was just talking about, that a basic distinction that occurs between sort of classical education and what we now see as education is that, like I was saying before, classical education is about encountering something that is eternal, that's true, right? Rather than seeing the world as raw material to be manipulated. Because this model of sort of seeing the student as raw material to be manipulated is also sort of writ out more broadly in how we see the whole world, right? Rather than seeing the world as something that has a nature, or the things in it as things that have natures, and that what we have to do is, in as much as we can, discover that so we can learn how to treat them properly. We see them as these things that are sort of fundamentally neutral and perhaps sort of even arbitrary, and that they can be endlessly recombined to suit our purposes, right?
Hmm.
And that what classical education hopefully is trying to do is teach us how to properly be attuned to the world, rather than, say, as somebody like Marx would say, right, to the proper question is not what the world is, but rather how we can change it, right? And that classical education is more focused on what is the world, what are we, how can we see it properly.
And if I can jump on Aaron, what you said, I love what you said there about, Dr. Whalen at Hillsdale College talks a lot about how we don't want to, if we approach education purely in the sense of mastery, of I need to get this skill, then we tend to see the world as, how can I use these these sciences, these ideas, and use them to my advantage, rather than coming to the study with humility, as an act of repentance, saying, I'm here to be taught, I'm here to learn. And we can add to that, that I think that whereas most modern education, in both its progressive and both its so-called conservative forms, tends to be utilitarian in its objectives, as Christian educators, as Christian liberal arts educators, the soul here is so much more important, like students' character, their own moral journey. And that's seen most prominently in the classics themselves, starting from Livy, Plutarch. Those stories are the grammar education of classical education. It is not simply education in facts, or not simply an education in how things work, but this is people. Here's how they act. How are you like them? How are your vices like their vices? How could their virtues be your virtues? And that ultimately is a process for the student to both see others, but also it's an introspective process for them to think about their own character, and to, as they prepare to enter the adult life, think about who they should be.
Mhm.
So it's about their character and about the progress of their soul, not simply the progress of their intellect and their abilities.
Well, and something I've noticed as well, kind of building on all of that. I don't know if any of y'all are in this situation, but I get to thread the fun needle of being a classical educator in a public school environment because I work at a public charter school, which is has exciting challenges every day. But something that I've noticed in particular with the progressive schools in general and ISDs in particular, especially after the pandemic, is they're not even really focused as much on utilitarian ends anymore, or even building skills. Um, it really, especially in Texas, has just become about test prep. Um, and I had a friend who taught at a public elementary school, and they didn't even teach history or science until the end of the year after the kids had finished their STAR test. They were told not to. You had to do 3 hours of math a day and 3 hours of reading. And if you had any leftover time, maybe you could get to those subjects, but it's gone so far toward just preparing kids for a test that they take one day a year, and they can't even pass that. And if you actually look at the way the STAR test has been evolving over the past several years, they keep moving the percentage that you need to pass lower and lower and lower. I think now for the Algebra 1 test that high schoolers take, you have to get like a 37% to pass it, which is not something they necessarily want you to know. And they have all of this language that they've used to sort of hide all of that. So you don't pass or fail, you do not meet, or you approach, or you meet, or you master. And nobody tells you that when you approach, which they say is passing, it's a failing grade.
Yeah.
And even meets is a failing grade for most of these tests. Usually you have to get around a 50 to meet. And so even in the progressive schools, it's just gone so much towards like checking boxes. And a lot of that has to do with legislation that's been passed by the state and the Texas Education Agency. And so, classical education is its focus on the person and the soul is so freeing, not just for students and parents, but for teachers. We had a science teacher come and work for us from an ISD. And she was initially very excited, didn't really know much about classical education. But she was excited because we didn't emphasize technology in our classroom. In the school she'd been coming from, all the kids had Chromebooks that they would take with them, and everything was done on the computer. And she was like, that's, just in her gut, she knew that wasn't good. And so it was a transition for her. But, the past couple weeks, she's been taking all her kids outside to our creek that we have on our campus, and they've just basically been doing nature study. And she said the other day, just like watching the kids and the joy that they get from being in nature and just discovering, looking at bugs, studying plants, identifying them, like trying to just appreciate nature and be in it. She's like, I think I finally understand what classical education is. And that made so much sense to me. I'm like, yes, that is what it is. It's about finding the joy and growing as people and experiencing beauty and just, being and living as human beings versus focusing on bubbling in some answers for a test that you take one day.
Mariah, I want to piggyback on what you said because I think it's really important. And I actually just want to do a whole podcast on this at some point. I was just the other day reading through the TEKS, which is the Texas Essential Knowledge Standards, which is basically our state standards. So every
Yeah.
grade, every subject has TEKS requirements, and those are the things they have to teach that are on the test. And I just happened to be like reading through them the other day. I always like try to keep up with it. And they have this whole new addendum they've added on adding the integration of technology and
Yeah.
technology literacy into the TEKS. And the TEA put out this whole list. And so I got onto I thought, I got to see this. The TEA, who you just mentioned, the text, what's the initials for that stand for? Texas.
Texas Education Agency.
Thank you. Yeah. So they actually put out this whole list of curriculum providers that meet their standards, the STAR standard or the TEAK standards for technology literacy. So I wanted to see who all these providers are, right? So I get
Yeah.
in and I look at their list, and I was so blown away that they had 3 pages, maybe more, 3 to 4 pages of all the curriculum providers that meet their integration of technology for pre-K. For pre-K. I was like, for pre-K, they have state standards for children who the
Yeah.
pediatricians recommend should not be watching a television or looking at a screen. And they have these state standards of these curriculum providers that sell all this integration of technology material curriculum
Yeah.
for babies.
Yeah.
I was just, I
Got
was,
to come on to technology while they're young, I suppose, right? And it's not like they're actually being taught living ideas of like,
exactly.
it's not like people are like, well, we need to use technology. I'm like, wait, so you mean clicking buttons? It's not like you're saying
Yes.
we need to teach them algorithm. They need to learn they need to learn Python and learn to code for themselves.
Yeah.
You know,
No,
we need to
yeah,
teach
there was this whole
science.
thing on
Nobody has put out these
coding
schools
and
learning to do science.
all the technology stuff that pre-K children need to learn. I was so I'm still so blown away by this. I was
That's shocking.
so upset about this. I just sat there for half an hour just going, what can I do to help people realize and understand how incredibly this is child abuse. I mean, I'm just I can't I can't even. I just can't. It's so the whole world is spinning backwards.
And
I'll tell parents. I'll tell parents here. We at our school, of course, we're private Catholic school, so we have no technology. The students can have phones, limited laptops for an occasional assignment, But I'll tell parents, a lot of here in California, at a lot of wealthy private schools, especially ones in Beverly Hills, the Bay Area, where like the tech CEOs are sending their kids. Oh, they're sending their kids to schools with like no technology.
Right.
Okay. The CEOs of some of the biggest tech companies in Silicon Valley will not give their children technology.
Yeah. No, it's just completely mind-blowing to me that this is happening.
and
That
to
they
sort of
have state standards for this.
Yeah, to piggyback off of this sort of general concept, and to sort of go back a little bit to the vital ideas, is as the classical movement has been growing recently, I felt as though for years it was this lone small group talking, and now everyone's talking about, oh, it's classical. Um, I am getting a lot of questions on how nature studies could possibly prepare rigor, and I have been shown pages and pages just like the one you're talking about for our state standards. Will the student attending the school be able to meet this, et cetera, et cetera? It seems as though they're just playing a lot, or they're just randomly reading books. It just seems very disorganized somehow, and in a way that also lacks the understanding of two key factors. And one is what child development really is. We have taken these children, put them into these boxes, like machine factory. They have to be able to do this at this point, and completely forgetting the neurodynamics, the the actual appropriateness of what children should do when. That's one thing that's entirely overlooked. And the other is when you look at a classical education or curriculum that is truly teaching these vital ideas, it is inherently rigorous. I mean, there is no way that a iPad or a box with a dancing mouse can compete with Plutarch or Shakespeare or you know or
Or a
even
tree outside
a
with
tree
birds
outside.
singing.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Recently I was talking to a bunch of young children about, wind in the willows and just the concept, the ideas of, rat and the mole and, what they're saying and what they're doing, versus, a screen with a preset thing. Because I was at a school where I was watching children with their little devices where they would have to read out loud into the device, which was then telling them it wasn't reading it correctly. They then had to answer questions and then randomly press a button. And if they failed it, they'd go back and randomly press another set of buttons. And I'm just not sure how, these quote unquote standards with this mechanized system is supposed to shape or form anyone. Whereas this, when people come in and they sort of say, "What do you mean they're sitting outside?" We recently had a tree taken down, and we cut them into stumps, and now these children sit on these stumps outside in a circle to read or to discuss something. And even the high schoolers will sit outside in a circle to do their rhetoric or have a discussion on something, you know. And the as I said, it's inherently rigorous what they're doing in a way that is very natural, and it sticks, and it forms their soul in a way that no standards or technology ever can. It's just not possible.
Right. That's true.
If I could jump in behind her, I promise I'll be quick. Um, because some of the things that Peach was saying there about science and everything, um, and that being the classical approach to science. And if you look through in history, the greatest minds and the greatest thinkers had exactly that kind of background. They wandered around outside and noticed things for themselves. And just to go back to your original question, as we started this discussion with, what makes classical education distinctive and different from, general education. And several people touched on this idea. I noticed that they're saying, oh, well, we don't ask this question, we ask this other question. We don't ask, we ask why, not how. And I think that the kinds of questions we ask as classical educators really set the whole process and the whole tone apart from the utilitarian kind of questions about how we can pass tests and how we can make use of the material world for our own advantage instead of asking transcendental questions about how can I live in this world and be the best person that I can be? How can I make a difference?
Mhm. Well, I would like our listeners to get a feel for what each of you are going to be talking on at the conference. So, if each one of you, one at a time, would share your name and the conference talk that you're going to give. I know a couple of you are giving more than one, um, and then a little bit about like how you think your session is going to help them and what they're going to walk away with. What kind of firm understanding are they going to have after your session? So, any of you can start. Just make sure you say your name and the name of your session.
So okay, I'll start. So I'm Mark Signorelli. I'm going to be teaching two of the sessions. The first is called Story and Civics. It's going to focus on the way that classical education prepares young people to be good citizens, to be good and fruitful members of the community. It's a claim that I think classical educators make routinely. I think sometimes they make some schools will explicitly articulate this as one of the missions, one of their missions, right? To form students who are going to be able to take their place, to take up a role in a station in in our democratic society that is as fruitful and virtuous. And I kind of want to contemplate that claim and meditate upon that claim and think a little bit about what are the justifications for that claim, and I want to do so by talking about the central role of story and storytelling in the classical approach, and how we I think we all as classical educators agree that storytelling and allowing students to encounter stories is crucial. It's absolutely central to what we're doing. and it's one of those areas, right, where that there is a clear distinction between what we're doing and what's happening in the non-classical schools, where more and more at a younger age, students are being asked to read more and more discursive writing, right, as opposed to stories. And what I want to think about is the way stories kind of help young people uh, learn about the human person, learn about human nature, learn about human experience and all of its complexities and all of its dimensions, right? All of its intellectual and spiritual and aesthetic and moral dimensions, and learn about life from the inside, right? So that they have an understanding of human experience and the human person as a real and a vital thing, as opposed to a kind of an abstraction or a theoretical token of human nature, which is kind of if you think about a lot of the ills of modern life and modern political life, a lot of it can be traced back to a habit of thinking about human nature as kind of endlessly plastic, endlessly amenable, and kind of interchangeable in all sorts of ways. Very very a very thin notion of human nature. And I think through storytelling, through encounters with stories, students begin to understand the kind of the thick intellectual and spiritual nature of man, and carry that into the civic realm. So I think that's something I want to spend some time talking about. And then the other session I'm going to be leading is called Before the Books. And that's a session that's going to focus on school culture, which is something as a school administrator, I spend a lot of time thinking about, a lot of time dealing with. I think one of the challenges, I think a number of folks have alluded to in the conversation tonight. I've alluded to myself. We are appropriating this tradition and implementing this tradition in a very unique time and place with a very unique kind of culture and very unique challenges that stem from it. And the students come into our buildings every bit. This I think if we want to talk about one area where there's not necessarily a distinction between classical and non-classical, students are coming into our buildings every bit as affected by the culture as they are walking into non-classical schools, right? So they are imbibing much of the problematic elements in the culture through technology, as we talked about, which augments the influence of those toxic elements many times over, but through their friends and their relations and so on, and they're bringing that into the building. And so there's a real challenge then in implementing this approach, implementing this vision in the face of those kind of adverse winds that we're facing. And so it's really important, I think, for classical educators to build up a school community, build up a school culture that can serve as a counterpoint to the culture outside the building, right? So that students come into the building and they adopt a certain mindset, they adopt a certain mentality that is appropriate to the work of the day, to the work that they're being asked to do, and that kind of sets them off in a different space, right? That there's a sense that when they walk in the building, they're walking into a space that's dedicated to a different kind of pursuit, a higher kind of pursuit. And the way you do that, and the way teachers and faculty and administrators and students and families all work together to create that culture and to create that learning environment, that's something I want to spend some time talking about during that session.
Okay, that's great. Who would like to share next what their session is about?
I'll go next. So I'm Jonathan Fiore, and my wife, Kiernan, and I will be giving a session on June 29th about the things we carry. Two graduates of classical education reflect on its impact. Kiernan and I are lifelong classical educators, but we were also classically educated ourselves. And as such, we're in some ways part of the first generation of students who were actually given a classical education, like Peach was, from childhood onward. Now, where we lived in the 90s and late 80s and early 2000s, homeschooling was no longer quite illegal, but it was still held in suspicion, and there was still hostility depending on the state you lived in. even from parents or families, grandparents, or cousins who at least had questions. What is this? Where are your textbooks? Starting out, that meant that homeschoolers had to rely on textbooks from Christian schools like Bob Jones and Pensacola, who, while being Christian, were nevertheless not liberal arts.
Mm.
They were textbooks at their core. Um, Both of us experienced then, well, as our parents became frustrated with a lot of these programs, we experienced the life giving power and transformative experience of reading the classics and engaging with the liberal arts. And so both of us ended up going on to Hillsdale College, um, and continuing those studies. And it's fair to say that those studies have ruined both of us for this modern world in the best way possible. Um, you know, there's something about and it's a process that sometimes is not always easy because our goals are not utilitarian, and so we're in such a materialistic culture, such a grasping and avaricious culture, um, that when that's not the goal of the education, at first that can be kind of, at some point, especially as you enter adulthood, that can be frustrating. And as I've continued through adulthood, the life-giving power of my liberal education has seemed more and more and more valuable. So our experiences, the positives, the negatives, we want to bring out. Mrs. Smith, you brought up science. I was taught, I was given a very good scientific education um, through the textbooks of Dr. J. Weil. Quite competent, quite successful in many ways. I learned very many good skills, and I had no love for science by the end of it. And so that has stuck with me. And I now know that I have a lot of interest in science. It's as I tell my students, biology is not boring. I'm boring. you know, why am I not interested in the very nature of my being and all the organic things around me? That is, of course, of the highest interest. So we're going to talk about our parents, our mothers particularly, but also our fathers, what they gave us, how they modeled that. We're going to talk about our experiences in high school. Kiernan with her dialectical study of classics and love of Shakespeare that budded. For me, it was Wes Callahan and Dr. George Grant and just reading tons of classics, reading tons of books. And so, yeah, that's what we're going to talk about and how we apply that to as teachers. We're both classical educators in a parochial school. We live this, we teach it now, we carry the tradition on. And so that's something that we're both very passionate about and love to share our thoughts and the lessons we've learned with our audience.
Good. That's good. Okay. Next, who wants to share?
Well, I can if everyone else is ready. So the title of my talk is "The Children Ask for Bread," which, like many of my titles, I just lifted out of Charlotte Mason's one of her volumes. But of course, she's quoting scripture. Where it's in one of Jesus' parables. He says, if children ask for bread, will you give them a stone? And Charlotte Mason, of course, as she often did, applied that concept to education. And so the focus of the talk is going to be on the fact that, at its heart, classical education, a Charlotte Mason education, is about what children really need to grow and thrive. Obviously, we're not talking about their physical food. We're talking about that spiritual food that education needs to be to address that non-material spiritual side of who we are as persons, and how very easy it is in our modern culture to substitute all kinds of really big, important looking stones for something that isn't. I mean, the children ask for bread. Like, it's really basic and simple. You're meeting their needs with the we've talked about stories and nature study, and I mean, Plutarch and Shakespeare ultimately are just stories, you know. They're presented as stories, and that is the daily bread. Like that's just what children
Mhm.
fundamentally need. And so I just want to go ahead and look at the fact that, when we talk about classical education, we really aren't talking about trying to give our students something that is not necessary. Like it's just, oh, this is a really nice thing, this would be a really nice thing to have. No, we're talking about something really fundamental that you need to grow as a person. And they're literally hungry for it, the way they'd be hungry for bread. And
Mhm.
I think that particular perspective, if you realize that that's really what you're doing when you, as a classical educator, and you're teaching your children, is you're literally giving them bread of life. Um, it's almost like fulfilling uh, Jesus' admonition to feed my sheep. This is important. So the children ask for bread is the title of my talk, and
Okay.
that's where we're going.
That sounds great. It sounds like it dovetails nicely with my talk. I'll go ahead and share mine. Mine is called Loving Many Things. And I chose that because to me, it fit perfectly with vital ideas. um, but I also, as a homeschool mom, I remember feeling, and I've seen this in classrooms too, with teachers going, well, how do I fit it all in? And so that idea of, well, Charlotte Mason talks about giving a feast to the children, and I'm like, well, how do we decide what needs to be part of a feast? Again, this is why I think it piggybacks nicely on what Karen's going to talk about. And so, how do we determine that? And I kind of want to weave within this talk um, how this type of education and giving the children a feast, what the feast looks like, but how that feast will help them to learn to do what is good, to love what is beautiful, and to know what is true. Because that's really the role of the truth, the idea of truth, goodness, and beauty. The role is that they're going to help the kids do and to know and to love. And so that's what my talk will be. Okay. So who wants to share next?
I
I
can go
can.
ahead. Oh, you go
Okay.
ahead
Oh,
first.
okay. I'm Mariah Martinez, and I'm giving two talks. Um, and so the first one that I'm giving is called Introducing Two Types of Classical Pedagogy, Mimetic and Socratic. And so really that one was kind of born this year when we were doing in-service for our teachers. And we because we're a public charter school, a lot of our teachers come to us because they're dissatisfied with ISD schools. Um, and they don't necessarily know, however, what classical education is. They know that we're different and we don't do some of the things that they didn't like at the public schools. We don't have a focus on the star as much. I mean, we have to take it, but it's not our focus. We don't, use technology really in the classrooms besides, like having to type things out. But at the end of the day, a lot of them were like, okay, but what does it mean to teach classically? You're not giving me a textbook, you're giving me a book list. What do you want me to do with this? And so we spent some time before school this year just kind of going over, okay, what in some real basic chunks, what is classical pedagogy? And kind of split it into two categories. This idea of teaching mimetically, teaching through imitation. And so there are some different types of techniques that you can use that play into that. Because at bottom, humans are imitative. That's how babies learn to talk. And if you want to fix your sink, and you don't want to call a plumber, you'll watch YouTube videos and like mimic what the people in the video are doing, and hopefully it works out. So using that human impulse, that impulse to imitate, um, through sort of this mimesis. That's one branch of it, and then the other branch um, of a classical pedagogy, and this is simplified, is that Socratic branch where you're training your reason through the use of language and discussion in a group. And so some of it can be dialectical and some of it's rhetorical, and it all plays into that. And so that one is, really for people who are like, okay, I like this, it sounds great, love the ideas, now what do I do? And then the second session that I'm doing is called Recitation, a Rhetorical Art for Pre-K 12. And well, I was always excited about it, but I'm even more excited about it now than I was earlier, because it's one thing to actually, make your students do recitation. And sometimes there's like a little bit of pulling of teeth and, um, but we recently took a group of students to England as sort of a junior senior trip. And our tour guide who stayed with us the whole time was an actor. And in particular, he was a Shakespearean actor, and he was phenomenal. And so, he would just, stop sometimes and start, reciting, these Shakespearean monologues. And he had just tons of like poetry at his disposal that he would bring out when we, visited, various sites. He had like portions of novels memorized. And so he was like a walking, talking, rhetorician in a sense, because he had all of this drama and poetry and literature just like living in his soul. And what that ended up doing for our students was, one, inspiring them to take recitation more seriously, and also it inspired them to start choosing things on their own to memorize and to learn how to recite. And what that in turn ended up doing is it made the trip more meaningful for them, but it also made coming home and the things that they were doing in class more meaningful, because now they're thinking about the things that we're doing in a different way. It's not just like, what does this mean or what does it say, but how does it sound? What does it do when it lives in your heart and your soul? And so recitation, a rhetorical art for pre-K through 12.
All right, Aaron, you want to go next?
Sure. So my name's Aaron Mitchell. I'll be presenting a talk called Teaching Euclid as a Way Beyond Gnostic Cartesian Mathematics. So this talk is really born of, I've been teaching Euclid's elements to ninth graders for the past 3 years now. And there were just some strange things that occurred to me as I was doing it. One was that I noticed that students who other math teachers would tell me, they would warn me and say, this particular student is one who sort of has math aversion, or they find it sort of intimidating, that my experience with them in teaching them Euclid's elements was very different, right? Those students very, very quickly took to the elements in a way that did not reflect the descriptions I was given of them from other math classes. The other thing was personal that I noticed, which was it just seemed to me that there were different sort of working assumptions underneath Euclid about basic questions about math, like what is a number? Questions that we don't often ask when we teach math. We teach procedure, but we don't ask what is a number. What does it mean to quantify something, right? And so what I discovered in teaching this class was something that I think I intuited but didn't really fully understand, which is that when we look at basically post-Cartesian approaches to mathematics versus pre-Cartesian ones, we actually start to see a totally different understanding of what a number is in a fundamental sense. And that the ancient Greek notion of what a number is has to do in a lot of ways with, this is oversimplified, but with an intuitive experience of the world and the way in which number appears to us through that experience of the world, rather than a sort of perfectly sort of created system of calculation that is used to try to manipulate the world to create the ends that we want, like to go to the moon, right? And I don't mean to say that that's necessarily bad. Tools aren't evil, hammers aren't evil, but hammers are very different than telescopes. Hammers don't let us see the world; they reshape it. But that what the Greeks are doing is something sort of ontological. It's concerned with being. It's concerned with seeing the world rightly and understanding it. And so what I'd like to do in my talk is sort of give a brief overview of the history of mathematics and a brief overview of an ancient conception of quantity and a post-Cartesian one. And then using Euclid as a model of this older way of doing things, see what we might be able to do, not just in ninth grade geometry, but across curricula uh, to encounter number in the world.
I love
That
that.
would be
That
something that
sounds
we
really
couldn't see.
fun. Okay, Peach, you're the last one.
So I'm Peach Smith, and the title of my talk will be Teaching Science Classically. And I'm coming at this from a couple of different approaches. One is the classroom teacher, but also the homeschooling parent. And I'm coming again from having had both experiences. I homeschooled my own children through the 90s into the early 2000s. Um, Later than that. Uh, Never mind. First decade of the 2000s, so through the 90s and first decade of 2000s, I homeschooled my children, taught the entire time as well, taught in different scenarios and situations, and I have a great love for teaching science. And what I would like to share in this is truly the hands-on practical ways of teaching science. So this is not theory. This is not any, background concept that will be integrated into it inherently, of course. But my goal is that every person who listens to my talk is walks away with some very concrete methods and ideas of how to implement their science, whether it's as a homeschooler or whether you're teaching in a classroom, or you're an administrator who's trying to figure out how to teach science or how to encourage science to be taught classically. Both science and mathematics is sometimes categorized as, well, that's not liberal arts. They can sort of continue being taught as they do in every public school, and it's going to be this linear thing, and somehow that doesn't classical method doesn't apply to that, right? Which I think it couldn't be further from the truth. And so what I'm going to do is really show that you can teach science by integrating all the other subjects. So when I teach science, there's history in it, there's language in it. I have blasted the 1812 overture in my physics class. We've done the craziest things, from shooting balls off of a roof, and listening to poetry and learning about the history. We looked at great paintings as part of science, because it isn't an isolated thing. Science is the incredible beauty of the creation, of the world around us, of the individual human being. I have a particular love for chemistry, so I've been teaching chemistry for many, many years. So it's a both, just how do you structure such a class? What
Mhm.
materials can you use? What if you're teaching and you're told you must teach this textbook, right? You can teach classically using a textbook. You can also teach classically without a textbook. So I'm hoping to give resources, information, hands-on, practical content for pretty much all the sciences, and that includes the fact that you don't have to stick to just chemistry or just physics. I don't think I've ever taught a single year of science, and I've been teaching since 1990, where it's been just the one science, because at some point they're so integrated, and in some aspect there's always ethics, there's logic, there's faith. There's so many things to integrate into the sciences. So to really sort of give a snapshot of what that can look like. So tools, information, background, and maybe almost like a mini lesson of, okay, here's how you can integrate 3 or 4 different what is
Hmm.
considered different branches of science into one as a story, as part of who we are. So that's what I'm hoping to present in my story,
Well, that
my
sounds
presentation.
great. That sounds great. Well, a couple of our speakers aren't here on this interview. John Heitzenreiter, Benjamin Lyda, Dr. Steve Matwitty, and Sarah Schrag are also going to be presenting, and they're not here. But any of our listeners who want to look at the conference schedule, the description of each conference, it's on our website. There's a link to view the details for the conference. And what I'd like to I always close all of my podcasts asking our guest to share a quote that has had an impact on their life or a book they had wished they had read sooner. But with all of you, I wanted to instead ask you to just share one quote from a person who has had a great impact on your philosophy of education. And so you can each just kind of go around and just read your quote.
All right. So how about I start? And
Okay.
I can go for it. All right. So my quote is from one of my absolute favorite authors, and that's Stratford Caldecott. And Strat had a wonderful way of summarizing things. So this section is my favorite. Is from his book Beauty in the Word: Rethinking the Foundations of Education. And he said, education is not primarily about the acquisition of information. It is not even about the acquisition of skills in the conventional sense to equip us for particular roles in society. It is about how we become more human and therefore more free in the truest sense of that word. This is a broader and deeper question, but no less practical. Too often, we have not been educating our humanity, we have been educating ourselves for doing rather than for being.
That's good. All right. Who will share next?
I can. Um, so mine is from C.S. Lewis. Um, and I mean, I think about it a lot because I work with middle schoolers, and sometimes it's hard to remember um, this, and so I need to bring it to my mind often. So it's from The Weight of Glory. So he says, it's a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest, most uninteresting person you could talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption, such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, we are in some degree helping each other to one or the other of these destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them that we should conduct all of our dealings with one another, all friendships, all love, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. And so just the people you work with, the children you teach, your family, everyone in your life is someone whose spiritual significance is just so much beyond our comprehension.
Mhm.
So I could go next. So
Mhm.
I pulled a quote from McIntyre since I had him on my mind. Uh, and it comes from an interview that he gave. He was asked his thoughts about education, and he gave a kind of brief synopsis of what a good curriculum would look like. And he says, students need lots of history, lots of math, lots of Shakespeare, the classical language is very, a very classical conception of what that curriculum would look like. And then he said, of course, an education of this kind, if successful, would produce in our students habits of mind which would unfit them for the contemporary world. But to unfit our students for the contemporary world ought, in any case, to be one of our educational aims. And I love that quote. I love the wryness of it. But I do think, one of the things, as I said, that we're aiming at is kind of giving students an alternative way of looking at the world, giving them a kind of alternative mentality and culture to feed their souls upon. And I think one of the byproducts of that is a certain kind of dissatisfaction or discontent with the world around them, right? For students, for young people who really love truth and goodness and beauty, they can't help but look at the ugliness and the triteness of the world around them with a sense of discontent, with a sense of not fitting in some way. And that's, I think that's what we want, because it's only young people who are profoundly dissatisfied and discontent with the state of the world around them who are going to be motivated to try to change it.
Mhm. Okay.
I can
Care.
go.
Okay, Aaron.
So this quotation is from Plato's Timaeus, and it's one that I actually put on my geometry final for my students' essay question, and it's something that I always sort of I read for myself to remind myself what is it that I'm doing when I'm teaching my students mathematics. So it says, the God invented and gave us vision in order that we might observe the circuits of mind in the heaven and profit by them for the revolution of our own thought, which are of the same kind as them, though ours be troubled and they are unperturbed, and that by learning to know them and acquiring the power to compute them rightly according to nature, we might reproduce the perfectly unerring revolutions of the God and reduce to settled order the wandering motions in ourselves.
That's really, really good. I love Timaeus. It's good. All right, who's next?
Okay, I have I have three. They're really quick though. Ideas have consequences, Richard Reaper. Okay, Lewis. To see through everything is to see nothing. Right, the abolition of man. That one has always haunted me. Livy, take things for yourself. Good, base things, rotten through and through to avoid, and noble things to emulate for you and your country. That's Wes Callan's favorite line. He always tells us that one. But the one I put on my syllabus is from Pope Pius the 11th, from one of his encyclicals. In fact, it must never be forgotten that the subject of Christian education is man whole and entire, soul united to body in unity of nature, with all his faculties natural and supernatural, such as right reason and revelation show him to be. That's the one I put on my syllabus.
That's good. Okay.
Okay, my turn.
Yes.
All right. Of course, my quote comes from Charlotte Mason, and it relates. I chose this one because it relates to the theme of our conference. She said, "Nothing is so practical as a great idea, because nothing produces such an abundant outcome of practical effort. We must not turn the cold shoulder to philosophy. Education is no more than applied philosophy. Our effort to train children according to the wisdom that is in us, and not according to the last novelty in educational ideas. Man, know thyself is a counsel which we might render, child, know thyself and thy relations to God and man and nature." That's
Which
from school education.
school education. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. I have one that I love and I turn to a lot. It is from volume 4, Ourselves by Charlotte Mason. It's the very end. And at the front end, I'll just say the reason I love this quote so much is being in the classical education world, there's just this obsession with reason and wanting to know the answers to everything and thinking we have to know the answer. I see this a lot in terms of we can reason, we can know the truth, and we can know everything. And it's just something I've just seen in different schools I've worked with. So I feel like this quote sort of addresses that from the Christian perspective that I think is really important. She says, "Where we err is in supposing that mystery is confined to our religion, that everything else is obvious and open to our understanding, whereas the great things of life, birth, death, hope, love, patriotism, why a leaf is green and why a bird is clothed in feathers, all such things are as these are mysteries. And it is only as we can receive that which we cannot understand and we can discern the truth of that which we cannot prove, and we can distinguish between a luminous mystery and a bewildering superstition, that we are able to live the full life for which we were made. And so I love that, because she's emphasizing that there's so much beauty in the world. There's so much that we don't understand, and it's okay as long as we're living a full life and loving people. And so I think that summarizes how I feel about life and education. So, okay, well, this was amazing. And anybody who wants to come to our conference, it's all online. It's at our website, beautifulteaching.com. And there's a page there you can read about it. You can look at the schedule. You can come and go as you want. It will all be recorded, and the recordings will be available for 9 months to anybody who is registered for the conference. So thank you all for joining us today and giving our listeners a little idea about your heart and what you're hoping to offer for those who attend our conference. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. You can get involved in a few ways. There's a Facebook page where we actively discuss the ideas around classical education. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/classical education. And if you want to help offset our production costs, you can support the podcast financially by going to www.classicaleducationpodcast.com/support. As the great artist and educator John Ruskin once said, "Well, my friends, the final result of the education I want you to give your children will be in a few words this: they will know what it is to see the sky, they will know what it is to breathe it, and they will know best of all what it is to behave under it as in the presence of a Father who is in heaven."